Alright, in this lesson we'll dive into inner joins in pandas. Now, an inner join merges two datasets based on commonly shared values. So if you're not familiar with SQL, I wanted to give you more of a visual representation so this makes sense before we dive into the actual pandas code. So here I have a list of all these SQL joins, and the one we want to focus on is this one right here. This one in the center is called AND inner join. And you can think of these Venn diagrams, basically the A is the first data set and the B is the second data set. And the point where they overlap, the point where they have values in common, is what the inner join is going to return to us. So in our case, we have, for example, 2 weeks of sales, and we have customers that came in on week 1 and customers who came in on week 2. And there are a certain batch of customers that came in on both weeks, and they're going to be represented in this overlap, and that's what we want to pull out. So again, customers that came in week 1 but did not come in week 2 will not be included, and similarly, customers who came in on week 2 but did not come in on week 1 will not be included either. Only those that came in on both of those weeks, only this red section, only the overlap of two separate data sets, the point where they have common values, is what's going to be included in an inner join or an inner merge, same thing. So I'm going to begin this lesson by executing our code to load our 4 CSVs, and I'm also just going to preview the first 2 rows of both of my weeks just to show one point, which is, in this case, we have a fairly lucky example because both of our weeks have the exact same column names. We have customer ID, for example, in this case, which is what we're going to merge on. If we had different names to represent the same data points, for example, if one of these data frames had customer ID and the other one just had ID, we'd have an issue because they'd have different strings, and we'd have to dive into some additional parameters on the method we're about to introduce. In this case, we don't, so the operation will be a little bit simpler. We will dive into, by the way, those scenarios a little bit later in this module, how to deal with data frames where you have different column names storing the same data points. So in order to merge two data frames, we have to call the merge method, and in this case I'm going to call it directly on one of my data frames. In this case, it doesn't really matter which one we call it on because it's going to give us the inner result, which is what they both share in common. So calling merge on either one and passing the other one as the argument is basically going to lead to the exact same result. But anyway, let's call the merge method on week 1. It's a method, so it does require parentheses, and let's take a look at our documentation with Shift-Tab. You can see that the very first parameter here is right. So basically, you can think of the two data frames as being side by side with each other, and the data frame that the merge method the data frame that the merge method is being called on is the left data frame, and the data frame that is being brought into it is the right data frame. So week 1 in this case is the left data frame, and right represents the week 2 data frame, which is what we want to merge into week 1. You can see that we have a parameter here called how, and that specifies how the merge is going to work. So right now it's set to a default argument of inner, so we don't actually have to change it, but just so that we can kind of practice writing this how parameter out, there is no harm to writing out that parameter and the argument explicitly, just so that we have a reminder that we're doing an inner merge here. And the only other parameter that we need to include here is the next one, which is on, which is basically where you specify on what column or columns you're doing this merge on. Now this parameter only works if the column names have the exact same name. In this case we do, as we can see here, week 1 and week 2 both have a customer ID column, and they have the exact same name and the exact same casing and so on. So we can provide an argument of customer ID as a string to this on parameter, and that basically tells pandas that I want to merge these two together, I want to find their common inner values, and I want to identify the values that are in common based on the having the exact same customer ID value in both of the customer ID columns across these two data frames. So let's take a look. So here we're going to get a new data frame. You can see it's 3 columns now, and we're going to have the customer ID column present, and we're also going to have a food ID X and a food ID Y column. So predictably, this one right here represents week 1, and this one represents week 2. The reason it did this, the reason it created those suffixes, is because it has to merge the values from both of the data frames whenever it finds a common customer ID. but it doesn't want to have duplicate column names. And since the columns are called food ID in both week 1 and week 2, it has to find a way to kind of separate them and make them unique. So it just adds that suffix to each one, and we'll dive into changing that in just a second. But basically, food ID X here represents our week 1 value whenever we have a customer ID of 537, and our food ID Y column here represents the value whenever we have the same customer ID in our week 2 data frame. So as we take a look here, you can see that we have some customer IDs that are represented more than once. Why does this occur? Well, this occurs because we have a customer ID that may be tied to more than one food ID in one or both of our data sets. So the easiest way to demonstrate this is actually to perform a filtration process, just so we can take a look. So what I'm actually going to do here is call the head method and pass an argument of 4, just so we have a reference point of that 155. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write a filtration process to just extract the values from the customer ID column from each data frame where the customer ID is equal to 155. And I'm going to do it for week 1 and also for week 2. So there we have it. So here, as you can see, we have 2 occurrences of the same customer ID in week 1. So basically, this person came in twice during this week. The first time they got food ID number 9, and the second time they got food ID number 1. In the second week, the customer came in once and they bought food ID 3. So when Pandas is merging these two, it doesn't know whether to add this operation to this one or to this one, because they both share the same customer ID. So what it does is it basically repeats the process, it duplicates the process. So you can see this part, 155 and 9, is coming from here, and what Pandas has done is said, oh, this 155 customer ID is shared in week 2, so I'm going to drag this food ID of 3 up to here, and that's where it ends up. And then it's going down further in this data set, and it runs into another customer ID of 155 in our week 1 data frame. It looks for that value again in week 2. It finds it again, and we see that that customer ID, this same row, has a food ID of 3 in week 2. So it once again takes this value and brings it here. That's why we have these duplicated rows for customer ID 155. So keep in mind, whenever we do an inner merge, it's not going to dedupe or remove any duplicate values. It's just going to merge those that have a common customer ID. So if there's more than one occurrence of customer ID in one or both of those data frames, it's just going to combine them in every single possible combination it can. So that's just something to watch out for. Finally, I'm just going to collapse this. We talked a little bit about changing the suffixes here, or rather the default suffixes here, which is the _x and the _y. Well, as it turns out, if I just remove this head and scroll a bit up, there is a parameter here called suffixes, and you can see the default argument is this tuple that represents what is going to be added to each one of the data frames. And if I provide the suffixes parameter here, I can provide a new tuple or list. Let's just do a list. And here I'm going to specify what's basically going to be placed at the tail end of columns that have the exact same name. So for example, for my week 1 data frame, which is my first argument to this list, if I want to conclude it with week 1, I can put a dash and a space in week 1 and place a comma, and my second string in this list is just going to be week 2. Again, these are just totally arbitrary values for the suffixes. You can place A or B or foo and bar or whatever you want, but basically this is going to wipe out these default suffixes and just replace them with week 1 and week 2 or whatever I specify here. If I wanted to do this, you know, let's do A and B, I can do that as well, and it's just going to replace those values. So in case you don't like the default X and Y to designate the left and right data frames, you can customize the suffix that you provide so that the columns rather that have identical names in both of those data frames are each going to receive their own suffix related to identifying that column and what data frame it comes from. So that's the introduction to the inner join in Pandas. We have another lesson coming up that's dedicated to merging on multiple columns, but this is a basic introduction to merging based on commonly shared values between 2 data frames by providing an inner argument to the how parameter of the merge method, which is called directly upon one of the 2 data frames.